And we're going to start settling in for the rest of the semester. Today we're going to begin to look at the united monarchy.
And I heard about the separated whatever. We're going to be united now?
No. This is before the separation.
Okay, who said that?
On your handout, last week we did the hop, skip, and the jump through the patriarchs, the sojourn and bondage, the wanderings, the settlement of Canaan, and the tribal configuration. And that brought us to the united monarchy. If you remember at the end, last week, I made the comment that at the time of the judges, there were murmurings among the Hebrew people because everybody around them had a king. Everybody around them was led by a king. And they wanted to have a king. You know, everybody has a shiny red bike, and I have to have a shiny red bike. Not because I need a new bike, but everybody else.
Is that why all the people lined up with the iOS 6?
Something like that. Better example, iOS 6. Thank you. Very good. So, God gave the Israelites a king. All right? And the first king was Saul, who was king from roughly 1020 BC to 1000 BC. The second one was David, who was king roughly from 1000 to 960, 61 BC. And then the third king was Solomon, who was king from 961, 960 until roughly 922 BC. So, the united monarchy lasted a grand total of roughly 100 years. But you will discover as we go through the semester and as we start looking at and thinking about the lessons for Christmas and the coming of Jesus, you're going to see why this 100 years is of major importance to a first century Jew. However, before we can delve into why those 100 years are of such importance, we have to take a sidebar, so to speak, and we need to talk about a phenomenon in the land of Israel that arose at the time of the monarchy. That phenomenon is prophecy. Prophecy arose at the same time as kingship, and it faded when the independent states ceased to be. That's not a coincidence. As you will see, prophets interacted extensively with the kings of Israel. When we talk about a prophet here, we are not talking about a monk, and we're not talking about ascetics. We're talking about people who were fully engaged in the state politics of their day.
Ascetics means?
Sorry, good point. People who go off by themselves to contemplate, almost like a hermit. Okay? That is not what a prophet was. And as we talk about several prophets, you're going to see that these prophets are people who engage the king more often than not by being in the king's face. And when the king doesn't listen to them, basically shaking the dust off their boots and going off. Not necessarily to consult with the Lord. Sometimes they just go off to sulk. Frederick Buechner is a Presbyterian minister, a retired Presbyterian minister who 40, 50 years ago wrote a little book called The ABCs of Theological Thinking, in which he takes each letter of the alphabet and he pulls a term.
Esoteric word?
Not always esoteric.
Okay.
Okay? Most of them are words that we use every single day. But he pulls them out and he gives them a whimsical definition. When he talks about prophets, he talks about them being in your face, in the king's face. He talks about them not being fortune tellers, but representing God to his people. And then he says, and he talks about John the Baptist, for example, eating honey and locusts and wearing, animal skin clothes. And then he says, there is a reason that you never invited a prophet to dinner more than once. We can't understand the phenomenon of biblical prophecy apart from power politics in Israel. Sometimes the prophet supported his king and his policies. More often than not, the prophet criticized the royal administration. The prophets were prophets of Yahweh. And they represented a type of checks and balances, not only in the United Kingdom, but as we will see, in each of the divided kingdoms. Prophets received their call, their election, directly from God. And so they were not beholden to the king. Don't think, for example, of the court jester from back in the Renaissance days. Prophets were authorized and indeed protected by God when they brought their contrary critical voice into the court of the king. Now, in 1 Samuel 8, Samuel, the prophet, who was also the last of the kings, as I mentioned last week, Samuel told the Israelites to have a king is to reject Yahweh. He told them that a king is apostasy. Again, I was going to say against theology. I'm trying to say it without using a big word. Help me say it without using big words.
It's basically a complete rejection and rebellion against God.
Better yet, yes. The Israelites, back around 1020 BC, wanted to be like everybody else. Everybody else has a king, and we want to be like everyone else. But you remember, one of the things that I mentioned last week was that the call of all of God's people was that they were to be apart. They were to represent God in the world that God had created. That was their call. Not just of Abraham, but the call of all of his descendants.
I remember you saying you have to leave and go somewhere else.
Right. And that call meant that they had to leave where they were. And we saw last week it took them on a rather long journey. All right? The Israelites were not called to be separate from the world. They were called to be apart. The world is here. It doesn't mean you stand way over here and go, oh, what an awful world. I don't want to have anything to do with it. It does mean that you are here in the world, but at the same time, you have a vision of the world. And you want to represent something in the world that doesn't look like the world. And at this point, the Israelites wanted to look like everybody else around them. All of those kingdoms on the map in your handout that shows the kingdoms around Israel, they wanted to look like everybody around them. The Israelites were called to be a blessing to the people of the earth, and to be and to live in the image of God, their King. To reflect God as their ruler. But they wanted an earthly king. They wanted an earthly king to protect their lands from the invaders and to protect their land so it would prosper. So the earthly king becomes the elected one of the Israelites, but in essence, the not so elected one of Yahweh. In 1 Samuel 9, Saul makes it infinitely clear that he doesn't want to be a king. Now you have to understand, Saul had had some military success against many of the tribes that were around Israel. Hence, he looked like somebody who could protect the land. But we're told in 1 Samuel 9 that Saul approached Samuel, the prophet, at the gate. Remember last week I talked about justice in ancient Israel happened at the gate where the elders would meet. So Saul approached Samuel at the gate and asked, "Can you please tell me where the seer's house is?" And Samuel said, "I'm the seer." Then Samuel said, "Go up to the place of worship ahead of me. We will eat there together, and in the morning I'll tell you what you want to know and send you on your way. And I'm here to tell you that you and your family are the focus of all Israel's hopes." No pressure whatsoever. Saul replied. Saul did not say, "Here am I, send me," by the way. You will see in a moment. Saul said, "But I'm only from the tribe of Benjamin, the smallest tribe in Israel, and my family is the least important of all the families of that tribe. Why are you talking to me like this?" Long live the king. Christine.
It reminds me of what Ben keeps saying in the sermon, that first shall be last and the last will be first. If he's the least of the least, he's the first of the high elected.
You hate it when God's consistent.
Thank you very much for listening to Ben's sermons. Saul never had that luxury, and the end result was Saul suffered from something that in college we used to say was called SMS, short man syndrome. No offense to any man under 5'5". And what I mean by that is all Saul could see was how short he was, and how small his tribe was, and how he was the least. Not that the least was something to celebrate, but it was a problem. Yeah.
Samuel will also pick Jesse's youngest son, David, correct?
Yes. Very good. Hang in there with that. As I said, Saul was chosen for his military prowess, but not for anything else. He did not establish any state apparatus in the lands that he conquered. And indeed, when he thought about what Samuel's words to him meant for the future, well, one of my boys will succeed me. Nothing that I have to worry about. I don't need an heir and a spare because I've got more spares than you can begin to count. Well, that's what they said about Wills and Harry. In this united monarchy, it would be Solomon who would build up the land and the temple. He would do little else, but he's the one who would build the land and the temple. Saul, now as king, was also seen as the representative of God on earth. And as such, he was an exalted figure. This didn't make Samuel a happy man, because he was dead set opposed to an earthly king. Only Yahweh was king. It doesn't mean that he did not try to advise and provide help to Saul. But he just never saw Saul as Yahweh's representative on earth. Saul did what kings do. He tried to establish a reign, so to speak. He made his capital a place called Gibeah, which proved indefensible. So it quickly got changed. When I say he made Gibeah his capital, please don't see any big white dome arched up or any colonial building on the top of a hillside looking out over a common. His capital meant that's where his tent was. And that's where most of his family would have been. It's an encampment. Samuel would anoint Saul as king. And he did it at Gilgal, where they had moved the capital shortly thereafter. And he anointed Saul king before Yahweh. Those are the words that Samuel would use. If you read through 1 Samuel, yes, Christine.
Does that before mean in front of more important than, or before here's God, you're being anointed in front of God?
In front of God. Because for Samuel, the earthly king would not be more important than God. But Samuel wanted it to be clear to the earthly king that you are king before God. Somebody's looking at you and watching. Right. We'll come back to that in a little while. Because he anointed him at God's command, Samuel grudgingly accepts this earthly kingship. But his alliance, because he has anointed Saul king, is now to this king. He still bears an alliance as a prophet of Yahweh to Yahweh. And it's not always the easiest ride for poor Samuel to try to live out both of those allegiances. In 1 Samuel 13, the prophet Samuel begins to use language that had not been seen before but will continue to be seen in the story of Israel, united and or divided up past the exile. Samuel uses the phrase, "Thus says the Lord." Now, sometimes when a prophet says, "Thus says the Lord," you can raise the question, is this the prophet's own views, which the prophet now is using, the Yahweh stamp of approval on? Is the prophet jealous of the king and is therefore going to use God's name? Kind of like my husband can beat up your husband. Or, and especially in the case of Samuel, is he just really uncomfortable with Saul? And if you read those middle chapters of 1 Samuel, from roughly 1 Samuel 13 through to 1 Samuel 17, whereas, who was it mentioned? Tina mentioned Samuel anoints Jesse's youngest son in 1 Samuel 16. But when you read that, I think it's a fair question to sort of say, when does "thus says the Lord" mean that Saul is indeed representing Yahweh to the king?
You mean
Samuel representing Yahweh to the king. And when is Samuel still struggling with the fact that he doesn't believe that there should be an earthly king? Yep, Tina.
From what I can remember reading Samuel, was that
He did, and so, let me assure you, do most prophets. It's not easy speaking for the Lord.
I think it's more complicated than is Samuel just representing himself versus is he representing God? And I think that what we see in all these figures in the Old Testament is God working through flawed, sinful, failed human beings with mixed motives.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
But God is working in the midst of it.
And certainly that was true in the stories of Genesis. I mean, Jacob steals his brother's birthright, remember? And then is driven out, okay, to escape his brother. And lo and behold, who shows up and touches his hip? But God. And Joseph, who could be a little you-know-what to his 11 brothers, 10 brothers at that point in time, they sell him off to, the travelers. He ends up in exile. But in the end, God has worked through all of that. Tamar, the wife of Judah, who was raped. Rape will come up over and over again in Old Testament stories that we're not even going to get into in the course of this particular class. But yes, God working through frail people. It's a point that by the time we get to the end of the era before Christ, I'm not sure every Israelite remembers the stories that way. And that, of course, can be one of the downsides when we tell stories around the campfire. Everybody's always a little better than we remember them. And in a few weeks, we will be talking about the literary periods in the history of Israel and what got written down when and how it reflects what's going on in the life of the Israelites, that they now feel the need to take stories from the campfire and put them into some written form.
All the sugar from the s'mores that we eat.
That's good. Yeah, Tina.
Just a definition, because I'm not even sure how to say it. E-P-O-C-H, epoch.
Mm-hmm.
Is that how you say it? And the definition would be
Well, they're probably, are you talking about an epic in a series, in a time period?
in regards to Samuel.
Well, you see, the other, you could use it in regards to Samuel in terms of the time period in which Samuel served as a prophet, but it was also part of the priestly garb later on when we get to the time of the temple. It was a part of the priestly garb that the high priest would wear into the temple. And they're both spelled E-P-O-C-H. And I apologize. Train's coming through. So you could talk about the epic of Samuel as his time period, but you can also talk about the epic as being a part of the clothing that will be worn by a high priest. I mentioned a minute ago that in 1 Samuel 16, Samuel goes out looking for a new king. And we've heard the story a lot of times. He goes to Jesse. The Lord sends him to Jesse. Jesse brings his firstborn, big, tall, handsome guy, rugged. Did CrossFit, I'm sure. Samuel says, nope. He brings number 2. Nope. Well, Jesse runs through 6 of his 7 sons. Nope, nope, nope. Samuel says, don't you have another son? Oh yeah, he's out tending the sheep. We'll bring him. And that's David, and that's the one he anoints. He's young. We're told in 1 Samuel 16, he's ruddy, handsome. Doesn't make Saul happy. Does not make him happy in the least bit. Because David represents some of the things that Saul is not good at, such as a power to heal, to soothe. And Saul will quickly discover that this little kid has some military prowess, and especially against big giants like Philistines. Saul's not happy. And so this dance goes on for the last several years of Saul's 20-year reign. It's a dance between Saul accepting that David has been anointed by Samuel and Saul wanting him out of his life. At one point, David's life is in danger. Saul is after him, and David flees to the Philistines, which turned out to be a shrewd move. He was able to hide himself in the Philistine camp. Saul didn't know where he was. Saul was very frustrated. And so Saul did something that an Israelite was not to do. He went to visit a witch. The story of all of that is in 1 Samuel 28. What was the first commandment? You shall have no gods before me. Saul goes to visit the witch, and she offers him no help from Yahweh. He is not a happy king. Samuel finds him there with the witch and indicts him for his apostasy. Saul's life and his 20-year reign will end in tragedy. Whether that tragedy was his weak will, or whether that tragedy was rejection by Yahweh, could be debated. But in the end, in 1 Samuel 31 and 2 Samuel 1, Saul's life ends. In 1 Samuel 31, it suggests that he dies from his wounds in battle. In 2 Samuel 1, it suggests that he committed suicide. Israel is not in favor of suicide because, you see, to a devout Israelite, death is as much a part of life as life is. Death comes from God, not from our own hand. And so in the telling of the story of Saul, we have two suggestions as to how his life ends. The clear fact is his life ended. Saul is dead. And so is his son Jonathan, and David laments both deaths equally and powerfully in 2 Samuel 1. In 2 Samuel 2, David becomes king. And the fun begins. David was supported by the southern tribes. The northern tribes held out for one of Saul's sons, Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth was not a strong man. And while David is consolidating his reign in the south, up north, one of Saul's generals named Abner, who was a strong man, ends up being killed by a guy named Joab because Abner killed Joab's brother. Why is this important? Well, Abner would have been the one to protect Ishbosheth, and if a claim was to be made that Ishbosheth should succeed his father, he needed a strong man like Abner to be the front for that claim. Instead, Ishbosheth had nobody strong around him, and by 2 Samuel 4, we are told that Ishbosheth is murdered by his own men. What happens in the middle of all of that? David, who has consolidated his life in the southern part of the kingdom, is able, by virtue of his might, to tell the 10 tribes of the north, I'm king. And there's nobody that they can rally around to prevent that. You might remember that last week I said, now we come to the united monarchy. Okay? This is why it's in quotes. We're barely 20 years into this united monarchy, and we've got problems. In addition to all of this, the kingdom is growing. The capital in the southern part of the kingdom, where David was a town called Hebron. But it was not a great location. It was out in the desert, not a lot of protection. David immediately recognized that the best candidate to be the capital for the entire kingdom was this city up on a hill named Jerusalem. Although that wasn't its name at the time, and I failed to write down what it was. It had a different name because it was the home of the Jebusites. David decided that this was the perfect place to be the capital of Israel. It was well fortified, defensible. So he captured it, named it Jerusalem, place of peace. How he captured it is an interesting debate. There are stories that he used the water tunnels coming down out of Jerusalem into the desert, and because it was fairly arid, he and his troops went in through the water tunnels. There are also stories that they threw hooks over the wall to get in. Doesn't matter how they did it, they got in. And the rest, as they say, is history, because Jerusalem became the capital and became the city that Israelites could not live without. Once he captured Jerusalem, David also did something that was very different. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Now, you remember last week when we were talking about the Ark, we talked about how the Ark traveled with the Israelites. So if we're going off to fight the Amalekites, get the Ark, bring it with us, put it in the middle of the encampment, because God will be with us. Christine.
So who was the Ark kept with? There's 12 tribes. Who was the tribe that was keeper of the Ark? Or how was that figured out?
I don't believe there was a single tribe that was keeper of the Ark, as much as if the Amalekites are fighting the Israelites, that would be one of those moments when we would stop worrying about which tribe we were and go into battle. Because all of these nations around them were so much bigger. And so the Israelites would need every moving body that they could get to go into battle. All right? And so in that sense, it might, we're not fighting, it might be sitting over in the land of I'm trying to think, the land of Dan, But once we're fighting, we're getting that ark because the ark said that God was with us. Okay? Again, think of what I just said. The ark said that God was with us. What word do we know that means God with us? Emmanuel. Okay? And that actually leads to a footnote that I didn't say last week. We're going to get into this next week. That is the shortened form of the Hebrew word Elohim. Okay? Words that end in El. Ben mentioned this about temples that are named Bethel. The El means God. Beth El means house of God. With us, God.
Any comic book fans here?
That's what I'm about to go into. Any comic book, any superhero that you can think of.
Superman fans here.
Any what?
Superman.
Right. Any superhero that you can think of that fits this equation.
I don't remember what it
Sure. What's the dad? Cal.
The guys who wrote Superman were devout Jews. And the names that they gave to the father and son from Krypton, ended with guess what? The name of the powerful one of Israel. Raphael, Michael. See, we don't say Michael, but if you were Greek, or if you were Armenian, or if you were Russian, you would hear immediately the reference to El. Okay? David brought the ark to Jerusalem, and it would stay in Jerusalem. And that changed the Hebrew religion. God was no longer wandering the land. What David was saying, what did you say?
He settled down in Fitchburg.
Right. David was saying God will abide, in terms of the ark, in Jerusalem. And David began to think about how he could build a place that would be an appropriate home to symbolize God's presence in the kingdom. Christine.
Were any of the prophets in his face about this?
Samuel was not, he had conversation with David, but not in his face the way he was with Saul. Not in his face. It wouldn't be Samuel who'd be in his face. The person who would get in his face was the prophet Nathan.
Okay.
Anybody know remember why Nathan got in Daniel's face? It's about the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba. You remember the story in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, where David, the king, God's representative on earth, and in the story, beautiful. It starts out, well, it was a spring day. David wasn't in battle. He had just finished his bath, and he looks out, and he sees this beautiful woman, and he sends for her. He sleeps with her, and then realizes, maybe I need to do something about her husband, because I'm in love with her. And so he sends one of his henchmen out to ensure that Uriah dies. And they concoct this whole thing about trying to get him dead, and all of a sudden Uriah comes back into town because he's going into battle. And so David thinks, okay, this is great. You're back in town. I can get you to sleep with your wife, and then if there's a baby, nobody will think it's me. But in those days, if you were going into battle, you didn't have sex the night before you were going into battle. And Uriah refused to sleep with her. And now David really needs him dead. And so he ensures that Uriah is at the front of the battle and he's dead. And the word comes back that he's dead. Well, Bathsheba's pregnant. She has a baby. The baby is sickly. David mourns, wails to God. In the end, the baby dies.
But Nathan comes to him.
But then Nathan comes to him. And he tells him a parable about a farmer who's got one sheep. One little, I think the KJV calls it a ewe lamb. And it's all the farmer has. And the big bad neighbor comes over and steals his one little ewe lamb. Carves it up, roasts it, carves it up. And Nathan says, well, David, what do you think ought to happen? And David says, that man should die. And Nathan looks at David and he says, you, David, are the man, but you shall not die. And with that, Nathan stopped mourning for the dead baby. David stopped mourning for the dead baby, married Bathsheba, and they had a second child, whom they named Solomon. So, when we talk about flawed characters, the list in the Old Testament just keeps growing and growing. And we haven't even gotten to the greatest flaws in David's family.
Maybe you're going to get to this, but we can't skip over the bit about David promising God to build him a house. And God says, I will build you a house.
That's just my next point.
Okay. Sorry.
If I paid him, he might be able to hold off just 2 more seconds, right? It was good, right? Okay. So David has defeated city-states all through the area. He's brought the Canaanites and all of these other people under his rule. He has unified the Middle East, and his capital is there in Jerusalem. And as Ben said, he said, I am going to build this house worthy of the presence of God. In 2 Samuel 7, the Lord spoke to Nathan, the prophet, and said, go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord of heaven's armies has declared. He will make a house for you, a dynasty of kings. For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build a house, a temple for my name, and I will secure his royal throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. If he sins, I will correct and discipline him with the rod, like any father would do. But my favor will not be taken from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from your sight. Your house and your kingdom will continue before me for all time, and your throne will be secure forever. So Nathan went back to David and told him everything the Lord had said in his vision. All of this has become possible at this point because the Israelites have land. They almost have a temple. The covenant here is to establish a dynasty forever. Unlike other covenants, there are no stipulations. It doesn't say, I'm going to do all this, David, as long as you stop lusting after other people's wives. I'm going to do all this, David, as long as your children are absolutely perfect children and never do anything wrong. No stipulations on this covenant. God told David that the covenant is forever, no matter what the house, in essence, no matter what the house of David may do. The other interesting thing is the covenant on Sinai was made with a whole people. This covenant is made with David and with his household only. David's primary function in the life of Israel has become dynastic. In other words, get a dynasty going. The military warrior who acquired all these lands, who consolidated things in Jerusalem, who built up the land, is now to build up a dynasty. Last thing I'll say before we end. So what about a king? Because remember, talking about Saul, Samuel said that having a king, an earthly king, was not right. There was only one king. And Israel adopted the idea that the king stands under the judgment of Yahweh. And the prophet is the one who bears that judgment to the king. The people will look to the king for salvation, which they originally thought meant protection, land, protection from the invading neighboring tribes. In other words, concrete salvation. But here, salvation is beginning to change. What that salvation would be is beginning to change, to morph. The king represents the people before Yahweh more than he is to represent Yahweh before the people. And yet, God is beginning the process of changing that last statement around so that the king represents Yahweh. The one who would be king in this dynastic reality is in Hebrew called the Messiah, which means the anointed one. Anointed by God through the agency of the prophets. Some of you may know Handel's very famous anthem that is sung at every coronation in England. Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anointed Solomon king. The divine presence being conveyed by priest and prophet. Because of that, the prophets began to believe that the king was called to be humble. Not necessarily the big military prowess, although that would be necessary at times, but the king was called to be humble because the king represented God to his people. So next week.
Just let me say a couple things about that.
Yes.
So making connections at this point is really beneficial and helpful. And maybe some of you are already making some connections in your own mind. But when we get to Jesus, the concept of Jesus as Messiah, as representing God, it takes on new meaning. He is God in a sense. And I think in a way that Jesus saw it himself was in terms of taking over and taking the place of these incredibly important symbols of Torah and temple and So God is present with the people in a special way, but as Messiah, he also represents Israel. So there's this sense of representing God and people. And that becomes important when we're watching Jesus hanging on the cross. What are we looking at? We're looking at one man hanging on the cross. Well, no, we're looking at Israel. Or we're looking at, and through Israel, all of humanity hanging on the cross. And then you've got this fascinating covenant between God and David. And on the one hand, there are elements of the covenant that clearly point to Solomon as being, in part, who God is talking about. But then there are other parts of the covenant where, well, how can you be talking about Solomon? Solomon dies.
Mm-hmm.
His reign, and David's reign doesn't go on Solomon's reign doesn't go on forever. So what does that mean? What does it mean that God's house will go on, David's reign will go on forever? And it's only in hindsight, after the resurrection, that those first disciples began to see that Jesus as a child of the in the line of David. The house of God is now continuing not in bricks and mortar, but in the indwelling spirit.
In the people.
God's people. So all of these things that are spoken about in the New Testament are having their birth, if you will, right here now with David.
1,000 years before.
1,000 years before.
And as I hope you'll see over the course of this fall, they all get massaged in succeeding generations. And when I say massaged, I don't mean changed so much as Israel continuing to grapple with what does this mean? And sometimes it's too painful to grapple with it. So let's go back to what it was, the great warrior king, or, pick some aspect of it that they want to go back to. Because, in exile, or when the Assyrians are coming over, or the Babylonians are coming in, it's just too painful to try to think, what did God mean about this dynasty? He must have meant David. That's what we want. We want a king like David. Yeah.
I have a question about the ark.
Mm-hmm.
And the Israel people thought that was where God and the earth intersected.
Mm-hmm.
That was their perception, though. That wasn't really where God and earth. I mean, God wasn't there, just there, right? I mean, was God universally available around, or was he just in the ark? I mean, that was their perception, but.
Well,
God
you're right, that was their perception. I mean, but what we know about God is that
so it's just
God
right.
can't be limited.
Right.
It's in that sense,
But
you know how people.
Perception had it only happened there, God, right? Not really.
I wouldn't say so. I mean, here's what, you know how people reverence the reserved sacrament?
Yeah.
Is God only in that container?
No.
And that's the thing about the ark,
We know now. I mean, but we know now. But it is.
Well, all right, I see where you're going. Yes, if you want to go back to 1000 BC, I think that there was a strong feeling that if the ark is here beside me, I am assured that God is with me. And if I go into battle with that ark, I am absolutely assured that God is with me. That does not mean that somebody back in the encampment giving birth couldn't believe that God was with her. But if I'm going into battle and I've got the ark, I've got the assurance.
And there was a sense, though, of God having sort of geographical limitations. I mean, there was on the one hand, they're aware of God as the creator God and the creator of all things. But keep in mind, all this theology takes centuries to develop. So
Right.
They've got the sense God is creator, but on the other hand, they also have the sense of where the ark is, there's God.
Right.
That doesn't mean he can't have power and jurisdiction and influence everywhere else, but there he is. And it takes the exile and the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple for them to really wake up to the fact that God is God everywhere.
And has been.
and has been all along.
And when we get to that, some of the writings, when we get into the exile, will reflect just this reality of, oh my God, he is everywhere. He wasn't just in that one place. Tina, and I've got to hop for the band.
Yeah, well, my question might be, the answer might be lengthy, but I was asking about the Star of David and how the people who still want David as, or believe David as king, the amount of tribes that are actually connected to David, that's what they believe in. Is Bethlehem, Jerusalem?
Do me a favor. Write down your question and bring it in next week as the first thing, because we're going to still be talking about David.